oops, sorry. This is really tricky. I have to do 3 fingers. That's him there, Raymond Collishaw. He is wearing a blue uniform, a naval uniform. But the people, his boys, that are surrounding him, you can see are they're sort of wearing an army uniform. And what had just happened, just as this photograph was taken, was that the Royal Naval Air Service, which was the flying part of the Royal Navy, and the Royal Flying Corps, which is the flying part of the British Army, were amalgamated into a new force called the Royal Air Force. And Collishaw was then made the commander of the Royal Air Force Squadron, and they continued. Incidentally, behind the happy faces are Sopwith camels, with a very, very successful World War I fighter, and sitting on the front deck are 2 vicious-looking Vickers machine guns, 303 machine guns. So, Collishaw is a totally amazing person when you consider his accomplishments. Look at his decorations. He has an Order of the Garter, a CD. He has 2 OBEs, a military one and a civilian one. He has 2 DSOs. He has 2 DSCs. He has a DFC. He was mentioned in dispatches 4 times. He has a Croix de Guerre from France. He has an Order of St. Vladimir from Russia. By the way, he helped the White Russians in their attempt to secure things after the revolution, which didn't work all that well. He volunteered in 1914 to join the Royal Canadian Navy, but they didn't want him. So he decided that he would instead volunteer for the Royal Naval Air Service in Britain, and off he went. He came to prominence in 1917 when he was the commander of the all-Canadian so-called Black Flight. There were 5 aircraft. They all had names: Black Maria, Black Death, Black Sheep, Black Prince, Black Roger. And in 2 short months, in 1917, they downed 87 German aircraft. So he went on from there to finishing World War I with 70 air victories, second only to Billy Bishop. And so he was quite an incredible pilot. He actually, it said about him that he would lead his boys in a fight with the German aircraft, and some of them were pretty shy and very, very scared. And they would dive down on the enemy, and he would give that airplane over there an extra squirt with his machine guns, and then when they were back in the mess, he said, "George, you did a great job. You have a victory." Actually, that's not quite true, but he kind of encouraged his men to be more aggressive. So he was quite a leader. In 1929, because now, of course, the Royal Naval Air Service is history, he's in the Royal Air Force, but in Britain at that time, the Royal Air Force went to sea in aircraft carriers. And the Royal Air Force personnel he was in charge of the air group for the carrier HMS Courageous, the one on the left. I won't try this thing with the 3 fingers unless I really have to. So there was the carrier, the Courageous. They had a couple of squadrons of flycatcher fighters. Those are the airplanes on the left. They were quite an amazing little fighter. They had reconnaissance aircraft and torpedo bombers. So there's definitely true that Collishaw was the very, very first Canadian to actually see the business end of an aircraft carrier and fly from an aircraft carrier. He ended his flying career, of all places, in the desert. He was the head of the Desert Air Force in 1943, fighting against Rommel, and retired at age 50. His Canadian Aviation Hall of Fame citation reads, "No airman has served on more enemy fronts with greater distinction." The airport terminal in Nanaimo, his birthplace, is named after him. So if you ever go to Nanaimo, think about Ray College. We're moving on to, fast forward to World War II. We're in 1940, in April. The Germans have invaded Norway. The day before, on the 9th of April, the RAF made 2 attempts to bomb the German cruiser Königsberg, which is alongside in Bergen on the west coast of Norway. Both of those attempts failed. I'm going to have to try the 3-finger trick. Let me just show you. We have a painting here showing Skua dive bombers. Let's see if I can do this. Finger number 3. Try here. There we are. There's one there, now with a vertical dive. There's another one here. There's another one just finishing his rolled and ready to go vertical, and then another one here, another one here. This one here is Skua. It has 8L on the tail. 8L is written on the tail. The pilot of 8H, which is not shown in the picture, was Alex Fraser Harris, a lieutenant, flying in the Royal Navy. He's a Canadian. And he claims that his 500-pound bomb hit the bow of the Königsberg. There were, I think, 6 or 7 hits by 500-pound bombs, and Königsberg sunk alongside in Bergen on the 10th of April, 1940, at 7 o'clock in the morning. So, Alex Fraser Harris, what about him? He's a Nova Scotian. He joined the Royal Navy in 1930, got his wings in 39, took part in this particular raid in 1940, and then went on. He became the commander of a Seafire squadron in 1942, and then moving on, he commanded the destroyer Nootka in Korea, then was the captain of the carrier Magnificent in 56, and rose to become a Commodore. All flyers have a logbook. In his logbook, he recorded 29 aircraft of different types that he flew. Moving along, 1941, the month of May, the Bismarck. You recall that was Germany's most powerful battleship. 2 days before, she broke out from Norway. There was a vicious engagement with 2 British battleships. She sunk Hood with a loss of, I think, 1,500 lives. I think only 3 survivors made it alive from the sinking of the Hood. And now she's steaming through the Iceland Gap, steaming south into the Atlantic. And all hell has broken loose. The Royal Navy is pulling everything to try and find it and engage. The aircraft carrier Ark Royal has steamed out from Gibraltar and is heading north. At 1910, 7, the Ark Royal launched a squadron of Swordfish biplane torpedo bombers. And at 2047, Sub-Lieutenant Goddard reported that his torpedo struck the stern of the Bismarck. There were actually a few other episodes. In fact, the aircraft first found the cruiser HMS Sheffield, and they did a torpedo attack on the Sheffield, thinking that it was a Bismarck. Fortunately, none of the torpedoes hit. They flew back to Ark Royal, loaded up with new torpedoes, and flew off again for the Bismarck. So this is, in fact, the second torpedo strike of that night. By 23:30, 11:30, they're all back on board, and 2 torpedo hits have been claimed. However, the people in command kind of discounted that, thinking that, wishful thinking probably, But then it was noticed that the Bismarck was in fact steering in circles. And then they realized that no, they really did score at least one hit, and they damaged the rudder. This Bismarck was steering in circles. And thanks to that, she never made it to Brest, which is where it was destined to go. And she was found the next morning by a number of Royal Navy battleships. That was the end of the Bismarck. She sunk about 500 miles to the west of Brest. So Terry Goddard, what about him? That's what he looked like. A photograph taken on the flight deck of our coil. He was an observer, not a pilot. He sat in the back. He came back to Canada, became a lieutenant commander, observer. He was a CO of 826 Squadron. And of some interest, for those of you interested in old aircraft, Gatineau, at Gatineau, there's a little organization called Vintage Wings. It's something like Canadian Warplane Heritage. They have restored a number of aircraft to flying condition, and they have a swordfish that is dedicated to Terry Goddard, and flies. And there's this Canadian stamp that came out commemorating Terry Goddard and Terry Goddard's swordfish. I'm not sure what year it was, probably around 2011 or 12 or something like that. Lovely little Canadian stamp. Moving on, 1944. Bismarck's sister ship, the Tirpitz, was used strategically by the Germans to disrupt all the convoys to Russia. She never actually did much, but just being there posed an incredible threat on the convoys. Not only did the convoys have to face the submarine threat, but they had airfields all along the Norwegian coast, and so the convoys were attacked continuously. But having the Tirpitz break out meant that the Royal Navy had to keep battleships around to protect the convoys. So getting the Tirpitz was extremely important. Operation Tungsten was a strike by 6 aircraft carriers and 120 aircraft. And the special aspect of this was an attack by 40 Barracuda dive bombers. Now these were totally secret at the time. They were brand new. They were also fearsome because they actually, aerodynamically, the Barracuda was a real mess. It was a very difficult airplane to fly. And many air crews died because the Barracuda dived into the sea accidentally. But anyway, so there was 40 Barracudas, 80 fighters, including Corsairs. And the strike was organized by a Lieutenant Commander, Roy Baker Faulkner. More about him in a minute. There are also 4 Canadians who flew fighters in that strike. Tirpitz was hit by 16 armor-piercing bombs, 1,600 pounds, but did not sink. So she survived. She was finally sunk by the RAF Lancasters about a year later. Roy Baker Faulkner, there's a book about it. So the first thing that he was assigned to do was he became a test pilot at Farnborough to try and figure out what the heck was happening with the Barracuda. Because if you applied a bit of right rudder with the flaps in a particular position, something really weird happened. The aircraft flipped on its back and dove into the sea. And there were like 40 aircrew that were lost. And so the reputation of the Barracuda in the 3 hour was absolutely awful. Trying to get people to actually fly it was, difficult. So until it was perfectly understood what the problem was and how it could be avoided, then not much was going to happen. Well, he happened to be able to do that, and then trained 2 squadrons to fly the Barracuda. And then he became the person who actually organized the strike against the Tirpitz. That's what it looks like. This is what, right here, the Barracuda, a wicked-looking airplane with a torpedo. in July of the year, he was off on a routine anti-submarine patrol in bad weather, and he never made it back. And so he died. The book Winds Over the Waves, which is, this is the front cover of it, was written by his nephew and didn't come out until 2010. So, in fact, Diane, when I gave this talk for the Naval Association, I didn't know about this book then. So this is the one difference between this talk and the one that you attended earlier. The three Canadian fighter pilots, four Canadian fighter pilots, Barry Hayter, Patty McLeod, and Don Shepard, shown here, having returned from the strike against turbines, looking both relieved and happy. Not shown is Hattie Gray, who was also on the same strike. We'll photograph him below. There was another little period which happened in 43 and 44. Canada had always expressed some interest in aircraft carriers. And in 1943, the US, under the Lend-Lease program, provided 43 little escort carriers. Escort carriers. And Canada offered to man two of them. They were called HMS Nabob and HMS Puncher. They called HMS, not HMCS, because under the Lend-Lease program, they had to be British ships. So the British ships, Canadian manned, and all the air groups, the flyers, are all Brits. But unbeknownst to most people, in fact, a few Canadians did fly in those squadrons, and I've listed their names on the bottom. So they flew Avengers on the left, little Wildcat fighters to support the group, and the Barracuda torpedo bombers. Terry Goddard was one of the pilots who flew in the one of the flyers who flew in the Barracudas. We'll move on now to towards the end of World War II, 1945, January. So what's happening now is the Americans have got the Japanese pretty much on the run. The Battle of Midway has happened. The Japanese are running out of resources. The Japanese are running out of aircraft. The Japanese are running out of pilots. The Brits wanted to take part in the Pacific Campaign. Churchill had persuaded Roosevelt that the Royal Navy should participate. The Americans were extremely dubious about this whole effort. They didn't want the Brits to be involved at all. And so the baptism of fire for the Brits was an attempt to send the so-called British Pacific Fleet of 6 large British aircraft carriers to take on the oil refineries in Sumatra. If they could do that, then maybe they'll be okay, and they can join us on the American side to actually be forced to drive all the way to the Japanese islands. So we're now talking about January 1945, and that was the day that Don Shepard became an ace. Now, an ace is a fighter pilot who has claimed 5 victories in the air. And on that day, Shepard shot down his 5th Oscar, which is, you can see it about to crash, over Medan in Sumatra. That gave him 4 personal victories plus 2 shared, and became an ace there. He was incidentally from Toronto, on Shepard. The same day, on the same raid, Leslie Durno became an ace, shooting down his 5th Dyna, that's that patrol aircraft above his head. A couple of days later, he was forced to bail out, and his body was never found. A little later, in July, Bill Atkinson became an ace, shooting down his 5th Grace, which is that Japanese torpedo bomber up top there. He was flying the Hellcat night fighter that you can see in the painting, the Hellcat, one of many taking off from one of the Royal Navy aircraft carriers. That's what they look like. Bill Atkinson became the RCN's highest scoring World War II ace with 5 victories and 2 shared. He's from Manitoba. Here's a rare photograph. On the 9th of August, Andy Anderson, who had been on a strike to one of the Japanese harbors, had been hit by ground fire. Aircraft was damaged. He was losing fuel. And this photograph shows the aircraft about 2 drops short of enough fuel to make a successful landing. He hit the round down, which is the end of the flight deck, and was killed instantly. He was the last Allied naval aviator to die in World War II. This is Hammy Gray on the 9th of August, a painting by Don Connolly. And you can see the aircraft. He's flying a Corsair, that's the bent wing strike fighter. He's obviously been hit. Something is on fire in the engine. He started off the flight with 2 500-pound bombs. You can see one of them is gone. He's got a 500-pound bomb. He's about to drop it and hit the Japanese escort destroyer just in front. So what actually happened that day? Of interest, the 9th of August was the day the Americans dropped A-bomb number 2 on Nagasaki. So the war only has another 3 or 4 days to live. So how tragic, this is so close to the end of the war. So I've already described what happened. He led the strike, he sank the ship. Immediately, having dropped the bomb, the Corsair went out of control, flipped on its back, and he dove into the water, and he died on impact. His remains remain in Onagawa Bay, which is on the east coast of the island of Honshu. So how do we remember and honor Hampton Gray? Well, first of all, if you've been to Ottawa, you can find his bronze bust just overlooking Parliament Hill with other VC winners. The absolutely rare thing is on the shores of Onagawa Bay in 2006, a monument was erected to his memory in Japan. It's the only monument to an Allied airman in Japan. It was done by Canadians with Japanese permission. What else? He's from Nelson, BC, which was, by the way, where my daughter lives, and I go to Nelson frequently. I go there at least once a year, or sometimes more often. In one of the parks, there was a monument to Hampton Gray. There's a Gray building. There's a Gray Peak in Kokanee Glacier Park, which, by the way, he shares with his younger brother who died in the Air Force. Another Gray. There is a Gray Memorial School in Shearwater in Nova Scotia. Vintage Wings in Gatineau have this Corsair that they have restored to flying condition that takes part in many air shows, and it's supposed to be Gray's Corsair number 115 on the side of the fuselage. There will be a HMCS Robert Hampton Gray Arctic patrol vessel sometime in the future. It's not yet built, but we're in the process of completing the first of this series of Arctic patrol vessels. And of course, he is remembered in the Canadian Aviation Hall of Fame for having won the VC. So now we move to the post-war period, and quite a different one. We're in peacetime, although it's the Cold War. So what happened? Well, Canada had committed itself before the end of the war to supply 2 aircraft carriers, 4 air squadrons, 2 cruisers, and a squadron of destroyers to go to the Far East. That was the plan. And so the 4 squadrons had been formed, the air crew were being trained, and in March of 1946, our first aircraft carrier arrived in Halifax. There she is, HMCS Warrior. Warrior was the last ship to commission of the so-called Colossus class light fleet carriers. These were smaller than fleet carriers. They were cheap and dirty, relatively easy to build. They had relatively light armament. They had no armor, and they carried about 30 aircraft. So not that capable, but you know, they were intended to win the war in the Pacific. So Warrior arrived. She had a squadron of Seafire fighters and a squadron of Firefly reconnaissance aircraft. And you can see them on the flight deck. Shortly thereafter, they flew off to the Dartmouth RCAF station, which soon was to become HMCS Sherwater, our only naval air station. However, Warrior would prove to be not suitable for the East Coast. She was built for the Warm Pacific, not suitable for our use here. We actually sent her on a cruise to the West Coast, and that didn't really prove to be too practical. Anyway, she was exchanged for another carrier, the Magnificent, in 1948. Now, what about the aircraft? Well, we had Fireflies and Seafires. Now, the Firefly is the one in the middle. It was a pretty sturdy reconnaissance aircraft. It could do anything, but none of the things it did super well, but it was good. And the other, the Seafire, is the naval version of the lovely Spitfire. And it's a lovely aircraft to fly, but it's a deck landing accident waiting to happen. The Seafire has a very, very long nose. You can't see over the nose. So if you want to land on the deck, you actually have to fly it kind of crabbing sideways so that you can at least see where you're going. It had a very dainty, narrow undercarriage, easy to bend, and it bounced. So if you're trying to catch a resto wire, bouncing is bad. Not only that, it had a relatively high stall speed, which meant that you had to fly relatively fast because otherwise the aircraft would stall, and that's not that bad also. So it was, as you can see in this collage of photographs, whereas the one on the left looks very impressive and very nice, the two on the right actually represent what frequently happened with the Seafire on an aircraft carrier flight deck. To make things even worse, in 1946, an engine problem developed with the Seafire, and so it was banned from the flight deck for all of the rest of 1946 and most of 1947. So the experience with the Seafire was not that good in the beginning.
Where was it built?
The Seafire was built by Supermarine in Britain, and they were subcontracted to a few other companies like Westland. But anyway, they're built in Britain. So here are some pilots of that era. On the left, we have Bob Falls, Robert Falls. I've met Falls. He was the captain of the destroyer Columbia that I sailed in Kootenay. We were often together. Falls became an admiral. He also has the distinction of having been the chair of NATO. So he grew to great heights. But anyway, there he is on the left with a smug look in his face of the pilot of the Seafire. The other smug look as he's strolling around the flight deck of Warrior. The second person is Stu Soward, who flew Fireflies. And you can see that he's having a spot of trouble in his Firefly on the last photograph on the right. The landing didn't go well. He's actually slammed his nose into a stanchion on the side of the flight deck. Stu Soward has a special distinction that he's the author of two wonderful books about the Royal Canadian Navy flying, Hands to Flying Stations, 2 volumes, 2 fat volumes. If you want to read about Canadian naval airmen, then that is a must. His logbook, 13 aircraft flown, 4,000 hours, almost 400 deck landings, and 46 of them at night. So, 1948, there is Maggie, HMCS Magnificent, always referred to as Maggie, coming alongside in Halifax for the first time. Now, she was the second hull of the Majestic class, which were an improved version of the Colossus class. There was supposed to be 16 Colossus ships. They built the first 10. Warrior was the last, and then the last 6, they upgraded the design to the Majestic class. So we've got Maggie. She came with a squadron of Sea Furies, and there'll be more on the Sea Fury, and a squadron of more modern Fireflies, the Mark IVs, plus some Firefly trainers. So there is a Firefly landing at Shearwater. The leftover, these Fireflies were the ones that were left over when Warrior sailed back to England and Magnificent came back. These aircraft were given to the second squadron, 827, and they served us until 1950. So, just a little story about Fireflies. This was the day in 1950 when the Fireflies attacked the U.S. Navy. Now, this is peacetime, over Cold War, but you know, there's good, friendly rivalry between navies going on. So, in March of 1950, Maggie was in an exercise off Cuba with this group of ships, with the U.S. carrier, the Philippine Sea, with battleship Missouri, some cruisers and destroyers, and Sue Stoward records. So the fighters are airborne. There's a Canadian on the radio. He's on the radio frequency, on the control frequency for the American fighters. So the American fighters are listening to the controller, and the controller orders 40 Bearcats, those aircraft are there, to do a 180. As they did the 180, which by the way they did reluctantly because they didn't quite understand why the controller was telling them to do a 180, but they did the 180. That left the Philippine Sea undefended. And it was at that moment that Maggie's total of eight Fireflies streaked over the flight deck. That's a Photoshop version of a photograph of Philippine Sea and some of her destroyers, and you can see the flight deck is crowded with aircraft. They're all being refueled. This is like a replay of the Battle of Midway. It's beautiful. Okay? Your aircraft being refueled, and it's being, you know, there's a strike of aircraft right over their heads. The American admiral was enjoying his breakfast just at that moment. And